she was marked by a love that should never have taken root, a devotion to her own blood that would ripple outward for generations, haunting a quiet corner of the Black Mountains. In the far reaches of eastern Kentucky, where the ridgelines of Appalachia fold into one another like ancient scars, the past does not disappear. It lingers in hollows where fog settles low and stories travel in whispers. This is the story of Eleanor Blackwood, and of the inheritance her children's children would carry, long after the cabin walls had rotted and the graves had sunk back into the earth. The year was 1924. While cities like New York City pulsed with jazz and neon promise, the coal camps buried deep in the Black Mountain Range moved to an older rhythm. Here, time did not rush forward. It circled. It repeated. It held tight to blood and land. The Blackwood homestead crouched inside a narrow hollow, reachable only by a dirt path that winter snow turned to ice and spring rain swallowed whole. For months at a time, no one came. No one left. The nearest kin lived 3 miles down the bend, cousins, of course. The closest town, Harlan, lay nearly 15 brutal miles away across steep passes and shale that shifted underfoot. Isolation was not an accident. It was tradition. The Blackwoods had settled those ridges in the early 1800s, Scots-Irish stock who believed fiercely in family loyalty and even more fiercely in self-reliance. Over generations, their marriages braided inward. Cousins wed cousins. An uncle took a niece. Twice, half-siblings sharing the same father were joined in quiet ceremonies. Each union carefully recorded in a heavy family Bible, its pages brittle with age and lined in deliberate ink. Josiah Blackwood guarded that Bible like scripture. A coal miner by day and moonshiner when the need arose, Josiah ruled his household with rigid authority. His wife, Martha, was his second cousin, a fact that stirred no scandal in a place where the pool of suitors was shallow and bloodlines were guarded like heirlooms. But what made the Blackwoods different was not mere circumstance. It was intention. Josiah believed purity lived in sameness. That strength came from keeping blood undiluted. The Bible he maintained did more than note births and deaths, it mapped connections. Lines drawn between familiar names. Notations in the margins. Some children marked with small crosses beside their names. Afflicted. Taken early. Eleanor grew up inside that narrow world. She never attended school. She learned her letters from scripture and signed her name in careful, uneven strokes. Like most mountain daughters, she labored beside her parents, tending rows of beans and corn, salting meat for winter, rocking infants through long, silent nights. 5 younger siblings followed her into the cabin. 3 bore visible signs that something in the family tree had begun to bend under its own weight. Jeremiah's skull sloped unnaturally, his palate cleft so severely he struggled to form words. Sarah entered the world with extra fingers and toes that curled like pale buds. Little Thomas never learned speech at all. He moved with a stiffness that frightened strangers and stared at nothing for hours. Occasionally, a traveling physician named Dr. William Harrison rode through the hollows. In his journals from the late 1920s, he wrote of physical distortions not easily explained by hardship alone and hinted at patterns, inherited frailties multiplying with each generation that chose blood over distance. Eleanor did not read those journals. She did not know the language of recessive traits or compounded risk. She knew only Samuel. In the winter of 1924, her first cousin returned from the Great War. Samuel, son of Josiah's brother, had been drafted in 1917 and sent far beyond the mountains. He had seen Europe's trenches. Cities lit by electricity. lives not bound by ridges and kin. When he stepped back into the hollow, the world felt smaller than he remembered. To 18-year-old Eleanor, he felt larger. He carried stories in his voice, trains that roared like thunder, oceans that stretched beyond sight, women who walked city streets unchaperoned. They began speaking in low tones near the woodpile, then walking together beneath bare branches crusted with frost. Their closeness did not escape Josiah's notice. It pleased him. By spring, he announced at church that Eleanor and Samuel would wed before summer's end. The congregation nodded approval. First cousins were nothing new. But Samuel had changed. Affection for Eleanor warred with what he had learned beyond the mountains. He had seen men crippled by war and children in foreign villages bearing familiar deformities born of tight-knit bloodlines. Somewhere along the way, someone had explained it to him, too much sameness could break a family. He tried to speak of it. Ruth, Martha's sister, would later testify she overheard Samuel arguing with Josiah. He warned that children born too close to kin could suffer. Josiah dismissed him, called it city foolishness, insulted his time away. "Our blood has always married this way," he reportedly said. "It keeps us strong." Snow lingered late that year. Isolation pressed harder than usual. The cabin felt smaller. Samuel and Eleanor were thrown together day after day, tension building like a storm waiting to break. In late May, it did. They vanished one night with little more than a bundle of clothes and a hope that the mountain might open a path toward the railroad in the next county. It did not. A sudden storm rolled over the ridge, swallowing the trails in wind and sleet. For 3 days they wandered. When Josiah organized a search party, they found them near a steep outcrop. Eleanor lay half-conscious, skin blue with cold. Samuel lay below the ridge, neck broken from a fall. His body was carried back without ceremony, buried among kin in the small family plot. Josiah forbade his name spoken in grief. He called the escape an act of betrayal. Eleanor survived. But something in her had shifted, not broken, not yet. Just altered. By autumn, her silence thickened. Martha noticed first. The way Eleanor's hands rested over her stomach. The way her dresses hung differently. She was with child. In other communities, scandal might have followed. In the hollow, Josiah called it providence. The bloodline would continue. Stronger. Tighter. On January 15, 1925, as one of the worst blizzards in memory buried the cabin in drifts, Eleanor labored without a doctor. The wind howled down the chimney as twin cries split the air, a boy and a girl. But the cries were wrong. Too thin. Too strained. When Dr. Harrison finally examined the infants months later, he noted asymmetrical faces, unusually small skulls, limbs formed at troubling angles. The boy's jaw protruded sharply. The girl's eyes drifted, unfocused, as though the world were already too much. They named them Samuel Jr. and Suddy. Winter pressed on. Inside the cabin, the twins struggled to nurse. Their bodies trembled in strange fits. Eleanor, only 19 and already hollowed by grief, moved through the days like a shadow. Martha took over much of the care while Josiah insisted time would correct what looked wrong. But time does not correct inheritance. By their first birthday, neither twin could sit upright. Samuel Jr.'s skull seemed too heavy for his fragile neck. Suddy rarely responded to sound. The other children, too, showed delays, smaller echoes of the same unseen pattern. What had begun as quiet family tradition was hardening into consequence. And in the spring of 1926, when coal companies began carving roads deeper into the mountains, when surveyors drew lines toward the Blackwood Hollow, the isolation that had protected the family for generations began to crack. Something was coming up that dirt path. And it would not be turned away so easily. The road crews never meant to uncover a family secret. They were chasing coal, nothing more. By the spring of 1926, the mining companies were carving new paths deeper into the ridges of the Black Mountain Range, determined to reach seams that had lain untouched for centuries. Surveyors with tripods and measuring chains began appearing within a mile of the Blackwood Hollow. To Josiah, the intrusion felt like invasion. County records would later show he filed formal complaints, insisting the land was unstable, the route impractical, the men trespassers. When that failed, he met them with a shotgun slung visibly across his shoulder. He made it known, the hollow was not open to the world. Ironically, that resistance drew more attention than quiet compliance ever would have. In April 1926, a social worker named Margaret Collins was assigned to assess living conditions in several remote Appalachian communities. Her mandate was vague, public welfare review, but her curiosity was sharper than most who came into the mountains. When she reached the Blackwood cabin, she stepped into air thick with wood smoke and something else, the sour, stagnant scent of too many bodies sharing too little space. 6 children crowded a single dim room. 2 of them, the twins, lay on a pallet near the hearth. Collins would later describe her first sight of them in a report preserved in county archives: infants of approximately 15 months, severely delayed in both physical and cognitive development, exhibiting abnormalities unlikely attributable to malnutrition alone. Samuel Jr. could not lift his head fully. His skull appeared misshapen, pressing awkwardly against the thin cloth beneath him. Suddy's limbs curled inward as though the world outside her own body was overwhelming. She did not track Collins with her eyes. Eleanor stood nearby, gaunt and distant. Barely 20. Her dress hung loosely, hair uncombed, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the cabin walls. Collins noted melancholic detachment and signs of prolonged grief. Josiah answered most questions himself. "They'll strengthen," he said flatly. "Mountain children take time." Collins's report prompted a return visit from Dr. Harrison. Unlike Collins, he knew the rhythms of these hollows. He had delivered babies by lantern light and stitched miners' wounds on kitchen tables. But even he was unsettled. In his journal that June, he wrote that the Blackwood twins represented one of the most severe hereditary presentations he had encountered. He suspected what he dared not yet say openly: multiple generations of consanguineous unions had compounded recessive traits until they could no longer remain hidden. Still, in 1926, there were limits to intervention. The state's reach into remote mountain families was thin, often symbolic. Harrison could recommend improved nutrition. He could advise spacing future pregnancies. He could not dismantle tradition. What shifted the course of events did not come from officials. It came from Eleanor. In July of that same year, she disappeared. At dawn, Martha found the twins alone in their pallet. By midday, word spread that Eleanor had left the hollow on foot. 3 days later, she was discovered 15 miles away at a small Presbyterian mission near Harlan. The mission's director, Reverend Thomas Aldridge, recorded her arrival in careful script. A young woman appeared barefoot, exhausted, nearly delirious. She begged for assistance, not for herself, but for her children. She described them as cursed by blood. Those words lingered. Cursed by blood. Aldridge had heard mountain superstition before, but this was different. Eleanor spoke not of spirits or omens. She spoke of kin marrying kin. Of warnings Samuel had tried to give her. Of children born already burdened. The Reverend, accompanied by a local physician and the county sheriff, made the journey back to the hollow. They found what Collins had described, but worse. The twins' condition had deteriorated. Samuel Jr.'s breathing was shallow and uneven. Suddy lay nearly motionless, her small chest rising in fragile rhythm. The other children hovered silently, watching strangers step into their world. Josiah met them at the door with a shotgun. It was only the sheriff's presence that prevented violence. Martha, however, did not resist. According to Aldridge's later account, she wept openly. She confessed she had prayed for someone, anyone, to intervene. Years of watching children struggle had worn her down. County authorities, cautious but resolute, removed the twins and transported them to the Presbyterian Mission Hospital in Harlan, one of the few facilities in eastern Kentucky equipped for complex medical care. Eleanor refused to return to the hollow. She accepted a modest position at the mission, laundry, cleaning, whatever was offered, anything to remain near her children. The hospital's assessment confirmed the worst fears. Samuel Jr.'s deformities were extensive. Respiratory weakness compounded skeletal irregularities. He survived only 6 more months, succumbing to pneumonia in January 1927. Suddy lingered longer. She never advanced beyond the developmental capacity of an infant. She remained in institutional care until her death in 1941 at 16 years old. For Eleanor, grief became something quieter, no longer frantic, but permanent. A stone settled deep in her chest. Yet out of that grief came documentation. For the first time in the region, medical professionals systematically recorded the effects of multi-generational inbreeding within a single Appalachian lineage. Dr. Harrison collaborated with a researcher from the University of Kentucky, publishing a 1930 paper analyzing hereditary consequences in isolated mountain communities. The Blackwood case, anonymized but unmistakable, formed its core. Meanwhile, life in the hollow began to fracture. The new road finally cut within a mile of the cabin in 1928. Josiah refused to use it. Isolation was no longer enforced by geography alone, it was maintained by will. But the younger Blackwoods did not share that devotion. One by one, as they reached adulthood, they left. Some married into neighboring families. Others sought work in coal mines beyond the ridge. By 1935, only Josiah and Martha remained in the cabin that had once held 8 children. When Josiah died in 1941, the Hollow's era effectively ended. Martha surrendered the family Bible, its careful mapping of interwoven bloodlines, to county officials before her own death years later. She requested it be preserved as a warning. Eleanor never returned to the mountain. In 1937, she married a widowed farmer with no connection to the Blackwood line and moved to central Kentucky. For the first time in generations, her children were born free of the compounded burden that had haunted the hollow. Healthy. Strong. Proof that something as simple as distance could rewrite destiny. Letters preserved in mission archives reveal her growing understanding. "I know now what caused my baby's afflictions," she wrote in 1932. "Samuel tried to warn me. I did not understand. Now I carry that knowledge always." She did not speak publicly of her past. Not yet. But the record existed. In hospital files. In academic papers. in the margins of a worn Bible. And in 1952, nearly 3 decades after the twins were carried from the hollow, those records would resurface in the hands of a young anthropologist whose research would drag the Blackwood story back into the light. The mountains keep their secrets for a time. But not forever. By the autumn of 1952, the Blackwood tragedy had nearly faded into rumor. The hollow stood empty. The cabin sagged under seasons of neglect. Moss crept across the stones of the family cemetery, and wind moved through the trees where children had once played in wary silence. To most of Appalachia, the story was little more than a caution whispered between older neighbors. But history has a way of resurfacing when science catches up to sorrow. That same year, a young anthropologist named Dr. Catherine Reynolds arrived in Harlan while conducting doctoral research for Columbia University. She had come to study Appalachian family structures, migration patterns, kinship bonds, marriage traditions. What she encountered was far more than sociology. At the same time, the newly formed Centers for Disease Control had launched early investigations into unusual congenital conditions appearing in isolated rural populations. Certain hollows across eastern Kentucky had drawn attention for patterns of developmental disorders and unexplained physical anomalies occurring with troubling regularity. 2 separate inquiries. 1 destination. Reynolds discovered the Blackwood family Bible in a county records office, preserved at Martha's request before her death in 1949. Its pages stretched back to 1803. What struck Reynolds was not merely the longevity of the record, but its precision. Marriages were diagrammed. Lines linked cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, siblings sharing half their blood. Next to certain unions were small notations, brief, cryptic acknowledgments of weak child, affliction, passed early. Reynolds contacted Dr. James Thornton, a geneticist affiliated with the CDC's Rural Health Division. Together, they began constructing what would become one of the most detailed multi-generational family trees ever assembled in the United States. The results were sobering. 7 consecutive generations of cousin marriages. Occasional unions closer still. Each cycle narrowing the gene pool further. Recessive traits, harmless when carried singly, doubling back upon themselves until expression became inevitable. By the time Eleanor and Samuel conceived their twins, the outcome was not random tragedy. It was statistical probability. Thornton's 1952 analysis identified patterns consistent with multiple recessive disorders expressing simultaneously. The cumulative genetic load, as he described it, had reached a tipping point. The twins were not cursed. They were the predictable outcome of compounded inheritance. Reynolds sought out surviving members of the extended family. One of them was Eleanor herself, now living quietly in Lexington under her married name. In her mid-40s, she had become self-educated in the emerging science of genetics. She read medical journals, followed research developments after World War II, tried to understand the invisible mechanics that had shaped her children's fate. Her interview with Reynolds was recorded and later transcribed. It remains one of the most poignant documents associated with the case. "I dream of them still," she said of Samuel Jr. and Suddy. "In my dreams they are whole, running in sunlight. Then I wake and remember Samuel knew. He tried to tell me." For years after gaining that understanding, Eleanor carried crushing guilt. She admitted she had once contemplated ending her own life when the science became clear, when she understood that love alone had not doomed her children, but ignorance had. Yet she did not retreat from the truth. She had remarried outside the family line. Her 3 subsequent children were healthy, living proof that outbreeding restored balance. She began speaking quietly to neighbors and church groups about what she had learned, careful not to sensationalize, but firm in her warning. Meanwhile, Reynolds and Thornton expanded their research beyond the Blackwoods. They found similar, though less documented, patterns in other isolated mountain communities. Their 1954 publication in medical journals coincided with a shift in national attention toward Appalachia's broader health challenges. The region was changing. Roads now reached hollows once thought unreachable. Electricity flickered into cabins that had known only lantern light. Radios, and eventually televisions, carried the outside world into mountain kitchens. Young people left for factory jobs and college classrooms. Geographic isolation was eroding. With it, the conditions that had enabled generations of closed bloodlines began to dissolve. Encouraged by Reynolds, Eleanor made a decision that stunned even those who knew her strength. She wrote. Her account, titled A Warning from the Hollow, detailed her upbringing, her children's suffering, and the scientific explanation that had brought clarity to what once seemed supernatural. Regional newspapers published excerpts. Educational pamphlets distributed throughout rural Kentucky included summaries of her testimony. I share this not to shame my family, she wrote, but so no other mother must carry this grief in ignorance. For a time, her courage sparked quiet reform. County schools introduced basic lessons on genetic inheritance. Clergy, once hesitant to interfere in marital customs, began advising young couples about the risks of close-kin unions. The language shifted from moral condemnation to medical understanding. But even as awareness grew, the Blackwood legacy was not finished unfolding. In the late 1960s, a pediatric resident named Dr. Robert Collins in Cincinnati encountered a perplexing case, a 4-year-old boy with facial asymmetry, skeletal malformations, and developmental delay. Neither parent showed symptoms. There was no obvious family history. Persistent questioning revealed that the boy's grandmother had emigrated from eastern Kentucky decades earlier. Her maiden name, Blackwood. Through hospital archives and genealogical cross-referencing, Collins traced her lineage back to Martha's sister's branch, a line that had left the hollow before the worst manifestations appeared. The genetic variations remained dormant for 2 generations, carried silently until chance paired 2 carriers together in an urban setting. The result was what Collins termed in a 1968 medical paper, Genetic Echoes, recessive traits resurfacing long after geographic isolation had ended. The past, it seemed, did not remain confined to mountain ridges. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, similar cases emerged. Families far removed from Appalachia discovered inherited mutations linked to distant, isolated ancestors. Advances in DNA analysis slowly illuminated what earlier physicians could only suspect. Eleanor lived long enough to see some of these developments. In 1975, researchers from the University of Kentucky invited her to participate in a longitudinal genetic study. She provided blood samples, answered questions with measured calm, and watched as science mapped what her family Bible had foreshadowed generations earlier. She passed away in 1983. Her obituary made no mention of scandal. It spoke instead of her advocacy for rural education and health awareness. Yet the research she helped catalyze continued. In 1985, Kentucky established the Appalachian Genetic Education Project, inspired in part by the long-term impact of cases like the Blackwoods. Counselors traveled into remote communities offering carrier screening, family history assessments, and guidance framed not in shame, but in empowerment. At first, resistance ran deep. Many mountain families feared intrusion. But as counselors shifted the conversation toward prevention rather than blame, trust grew. By the early 1990s, anonymous data revealed clusters of recessive disorders correlating with historically isolated settlements. The findings were clear: limited genetic exchange over generations had measurable consequences. The Blackwood family, once a whispered caution, became a foundational case study in public health education. Yet one final chapter remained unwritten. Because the hollow itself, the place where it began, still stood beneath the canopy of the Black Mountain Ridge. And history, buried beneath leaf litter and stone, was waiting to be unearthed once more. By the early 2000s, the Blackwood name had become a footnote in academic journals, cited in lectures, referenced in public health studies, but largely detached from the physical place where it all began. The hollow itself had returned to silence. In the spring of 2002, a group of anthropology students from Eastern Kentucky University were hiking along the ridges of the Black Mountain when they stumbled upon something unusual: a collapsed chimney rising from a tangle of saplings, a rectangle of stacked stone half swallowed by moss. It was the Blackwood homestead. Word reached Dr. James Carter, a regional historian specializing in Appalachian settlement patterns. Familiar with the Blackwood case through earlier genetic research, he recognized the site's significance immediately. What began as a documentation exercise evolved into a full archaeological survey. The excavation revealed a life more complex than the medical records suggested. The cabin's foundation indicated careful construction, sturdier than many remote homesteads of its era. Fragments of glassware and manufactured tools suggested occasional trade beyond the hollow, likely through moonshine or small-scale coal extraction from a seam on the property. Isolation, it seemed, had not meant total ignorance of the outside world. But the most haunting discovery lay above the cabin. On a ridge overlooking the clearing, partially hidden beneath bramble and ivy, the team uncovered a small family cemetery. Weathered stones leaned at uncertain angles. Lichen obscured names. Two markers stood side by side, smaller than the rest. Only initials remained legible: SB and SB. Samuel Jr. and Suddy. Though removed from the hollow as infants, someone, perhaps Martha, had memorialized them here. A quiet act of acknowledgement in a family that had long denied weakness. Local media picked up the story. Headlines framed it as the rediscovery of a legendary mountain family. But for descendants scattered across the country, it was something more intimate. In October 2002, members of the extended Blackwood lineage gathered at the site. Some had traveled from Florida, others from California. Many knew only fragments of their ancestry, vague warnings about marrying too close, stories half told around kitchen tables. Among them was Mary Johnson Taylor, Eleanor's youngest daughter, now in her 60s. Standing amid the stones and overgrown grass, she saw what her mother had once described: the crushing isolation, the narrow horizon, the absence of choice. For Mary, the visit reframed the narrative. This wasn't evil, she reportedly told a local journalist. It was survival in a place where options were thin. The gathering became a turning point. With support from the University of Kentucky and collaboration from the Centers for Disease Control, a community initiative was launched, the Black Mountain Genetic Heritage Project. Its mission was simple but radical: transform a legacy of silence into a framework for education. Workshops were developed for rural schools. Healthcare providers received training on discussing genetic risk without stigma. Family history documentation was encouraged, not to assign blame, but to inform. In 2005, a permanent center opened in nearby Harlan, named the Eleanor Blackwood Johnson Center for Genetic Education. The choice of name was deliberate. Eleanor had once carried shame in secret. Now her story anchored a movement rooted in transparency and prevention. The center offered free genetic counseling, carrier testing, and educational seminars tailored specifically to Appalachian communities. Mary Johnson Taylor became its first community liaison. She spoke not as a scientist, but as a granddaughter of the Hollow. Her message was steady: knowledge frees families from fear. No one should endure suffering born of misunderstanding. As genetic science advanced into the 21st century, researchers identified specific mutations that had circulated through certain Appalachian populations. In 2010, scientists from the National Human Genome Research Institute documented what they described as a regional founder effect variant, a genetic marker present with unusual frequency among individuals whose ancestry traced back to isolated communities in eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and parts of West Virginia. The discovery confirmed what earlier physicians had only inferred. Even generations after outbreeding became common, approximately 1 in 15 individuals with roots in those areas carried the variant. Most would never develop symptoms. But 2 carriers unknowingly pairing could still produce affected children. The shadow of isolation lingered, not as curse, but as biology. In 2018, the former Blackwood Hollow received formal historical recognition. Interpretive signage marked the trailhead. A modest exhibit near the ridge explained the family's story in balanced terms, neither sensationalized nor sanitized. Visitors could hike the path, stand where the cabin once stood, and read about how geography had shaped culture, and, inadvertently, genetics. What had once been whispered scandal had become public lesson. In classrooms across Appalachia, students now learned about genetic diversity as part of their health curriculum. Churches incorporated basic biological guidance into premarital counseling. Conversations once shrouded in embarrassment shifted toward informed choice. In 2021, Mary Johnson Taylor published a memoir titled My Mother's Mountain. In its final pages, she wrote that what her grandmother had once called a curse was simply nature's arithmetic misunderstood. Isolation plus repetition equals risk. Knowledge changes the equation. Today, the forest fully embraces the old homestead. Only stone foundations and faint depressions in the soil hint at where walls once stood. Wind moves through the trees much as it did a century ago. But the silence is different. It no longer hides shame. It carries memory and warning. The Blackwood story, born in a forgotten Appalachian hollow, traveled through medical journals, research institutions, classrooms, and community centers. It reshaped public health approaches. It illuminated how recessive traits can persist quietly for generations before resurfacing in unexpected places. Most importantly, it transformed tragedy into education. Blood ties, once drawn too tightly, became the catalyst for broader understanding. And in that transformation lies the final truth of the Black Mountain legacy. What was once concealed in darkness now stands as a testament to how science, when paired with courage, can lift even the longest shadow cast by the past. Time has a way of softening the sharpest stories. By the time the 21st century settled over the ridges of the Black Mountains, the Blackwood name no longer stirred fear in eastern Kentucky. It stirred reflection. The hollow where Eleanor once carried water from the creek now lies quiet beneath maple and pine. The cabin is gone. The chimney stones are scattered. Even the small cemetery above the ridge has been carefully stabilized, its weathered markers protected from further erosion. But history does not live in wood and stone alone. It lives in blood. Advances in DNA sequencing throughout the 2000s and 2010s allowed researchers to map specific mutations that had circulated through isolated Appalachian populations. What early physicians described vaguely as hereditary weakness could now be pinpointed to precise gene variants, some rare, some more widespread due to what scientists call the founder effect. The implications were both sobering and empowering. Carriers could be identified. Couples could be counseled. Testing became routine in regional clinics. What had once manifested as unexplained suffering could now be anticipated, sometimes even prevented. The story that began in secrecy inside a one-room cabin had reshaped public health policy across parts of rural Kentucky. At the Eleanor Blackwood Johnson Center for Genetic Education in Harlan, families began bringing old Bibles and handwritten family trees to counselors. Instead of hiding close-kin marriages in whispers, they documented them openly, seeking clarity rather than concealment. The shift was profound. Shame had kept earlier generations silent. Silence had kept them vulnerable. Now knowledge interrupted that cycle. Researchers continued to publish longitudinal findings based partly on the original Blackwood documentation. Medical schools reference the case when teaching about recessive inheritance patterns. Anthropologists cited it when discussing how geography shapes culture, and how culture can, in turn, shape biology. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation occurred at the human level. Descendants who once felt burdened by a shadowed lineage began reframing it. They were not heirs to a curse. They were inheritors of a lesson. In interviews conducted in the late 2010s, younger members of the extended Blackwood family spoke candidly about genetic testing before marriage, about understanding ancestry without being defined by it. Several became nurses, teachers, even public health advocates, careers chosen, they said, because of the family story. In 2021, when Mary Johnson Taylor's memoir circulated through regional libraries and book clubs, a new generation encountered Eleanor not as a tragic figure, but as a woman who evolved, who moved from ignorance to understanding, from silence to voice. One passage resonated deeply. What happened in our hollow was not wickedness. It was closeness without knowledge. The mountains kept us together, but they also kept us unaware. Those words reframed the narrative. For decades, outsiders had reduced Appalachian consanguinity to caricature, backwardness, superstition, moral failing. The full story was more complex. In isolated terrain where travel was dangerous and communities small, marriage options narrowed naturally. Add economic hardship and cultural loyalty to family, and patterns formed almost inevitably. The Blackwoods were not unique in their beginnings. They were simply among the most thoroughly documented. Today, visitors who hike along the restored trail on Black Mountain encounter interpretive signs explaining not only the family's history, but the broader scientific principles involved. The language is careful, compassionate, clear. It explains how recessive genes can remain hidden for generations. How two healthy carriers can unknowingly pass on a serious condition. How isolation amplifies probability. How diversity restores balance. There is no mention of curses. Only inheritance. And understanding. In many ways, the final chapter of the Blackwood story is not about tragedy at all. It is about transformation. Eleanor's early life unfolded in a world bounded by ridgelines and tradition. Her later years unfolded in a world increasingly illuminated by science. She bridged both eras, born into one shaped by isolation, and living long enough to witness the dawn of genetic clarity. Her twins, Samuel Jr. and Suddy, did not survive into adulthood. Their lives were brief and burdened. Yet their suffering catalyzed documentation that ultimately spared others. Across Appalachia, countless couples now undergo carrier screening before starting families. Rural clinics partner with research institutions. Educational curricula include basic genetic literacy. Conversations once avoided are held openly. The mountains remain ancient and unmoved. But the people within them have changed. If you stand on the ridge above the former Blackwood Hollow at dusk, wind brushing through the trees, it is easy to imagine how the past once felt inescapable there. How a family could believe that strength meant sameness. How love could blur the line between loyalty and risk. Yet the story does not end in that wind. It ends in classrooms, in clinics, in informed decisions made quietly and deliberately. It ends with a region that chose to confront its history rather than bury it. The legacy of the Blackwoods is no longer a shadow stretching across generations. It is a light, sometimes uncomfortable, always instructive, illuminating how human choices and natural law intertwine. Blood ties can bind. They can also teach. And in the hills of eastern Kentucky, where fog still settles into forgotten hollows, the lesson carved from one family's sorrow now stands as a testament to what knowledge can do when it is finally allowed to speak.